Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to be talking about Iberian women's clothing. We have gone over in a previous class the earlier part of Iberian women's clothing. And as part of that, we went briefly over who is a part of Iberia. And what we're going to need to know for the later part of Spanish costuming is that there were the Carthaginians, and then the Franks and the Gothic tribes, Roman influences, and then influences of various North African groups who came into Al-Andalus, as well as the Romani and multiple other groups in Spain. So I'm going to go over things mostly in order from Sephardi, Christian, Muslim, because that's the order that the religions were founded in, and that was just the fairest order that I could think of to not prioritize anybody and just take it in order. So I'm scrolling through the previous stuff we discussed about till I can get us to what we're going to look at. And you can get a little preview and see if you want to look at anything previously. Now, the reason I separated it between the 14th and 15th centuries, there does need to be a time break because it's a lot to go over as an overview class. And it's reasonable to separate here because the 15th century is when you see a waist seam develop in clothing. And you also see fabric production increase rapidly. And when more fabric is available, the tailors experiment more. So we start to see a lot more styles develop in a shorter period of time. So for the 15th and 16th centuries, even though there's only 2 of them, there is a lot more information to cover per century than there was previously. So for the Sephardi women in the 15th century, things weren't really good. The Christian kingdoms persecuted a lot, and the Muslim kingdoms were very strict about clothing rules, even though it wasn't as bad to be in the Muslim kingdoms physically. But things were rough. They were ramping up for the Reconquista and the expulsion. Some of the things you'll see in the Sephardi women that you wouldn't see in elsewhere are they won't mix the linen and the wool garments. They can be layered on top of each other, but they can't depend on each other for support. So you could layer a saya over a camisa, but you can't need your garlanda to hold your toca on. If it depends on one thing to hold the other on, it's not going to work. Most of the rules that were applied to the Sephardi were similar now, both in the Christian kingdoms and in the Muslim kingdoms. And those were the requirement to wear honey or yellow on their outer garments or headwear, or to wear a honey or yellow patch, or in sometimes a cord belt called a minak or a zunar. And those were mostly in the Muslim territories. In the Christian territories, we see some really fun styles again, similar to the fun experimentation we saw in the 13th century. A lot of these garments are similar to what exists elsewhere in Spain or elsewhere in Europe, but you can see that Iberia put their own unique flair onto things. So we'll look at the garments kind of in order that they come onto your body. We have the calzones, which are basically underwear, like shorts. And we talked about these in the 14th century, which is the first time they're mentioned in literature. And they're said to have been worn by Iberian Christian women earlier than other Christian women in Europe because of the Muslim influence. And while most often they would be worn of a similar fabric to your camisa, so linen or cotton, they could also be worn of silk, or they could be worn of fur. And the fur would be turned inward to keep you warm. And there's a mention of that in one of the queen's inventories. I'm forgetting which queen right now, but it's in one of the books in my bibliography. Then you had your calzas to keep your feet covered. And those could be patterned in various ways. And then you had a lot of choices for your camisa depending on what you were going to wear over it. So you've got the plain rectangular construction camisa we had before. And then you've got a camisa with a little gathering. The plain camisa or the gathered camisa both could be worn with these sayas or brials. In a lot of cases, the different word doesn't mean a different thing. It just means that Iberia had a lot of different languages in the Christian kingdoms. So there could be different terms for the same thing. Now, over these fairly simple sayas or brials, which had a waist seam and were gathered into the waist, have a fitted arm side, could have multiple gaps down the sleeve. You could wear a variety of things over top. Some of these were just called sobre saya, which would just mean overdress. But then you have a couple other specific terms. And not all of them can I match specifically to a garment, but I'm getting closer to matching them. This little one we're pretty sure is called a tabardo. And when I upload it with images, you'll be able to see images of a tabardo. This one and this one are probably called a hopa. This one also might just be a sobre saya. This one's definitely a hopa. This one is probably called what we call a habito. And the habito is listed as being basically loose from the neck down. It could be sleeveless. It could have sleeves. It's very similar in cut to the hopa, just loose. And it's not belted. This odd little dress is what we see worn with the Spanish whip version of the tall, pointy Burgundian hats. You don't see them in very typical so-called Burgundian dresses that were worn after the hopa. Instead, they wear these dresses that have lacing down the front and sometimes wide belts and lace on sleeves, and they're very wacky. So the Spaniards did wear those tall pointy hats, but they wore them with a very unique dress. And part of that is because of the next dress we're gonna look at, which goes with these camisas with wide sleeves with stripes on them. And you would pretty much only wear these striped sleeves either with a saya like this, with your sleeves off, and you could wear that with a tabardo or a habito, or you could wear it with one of these sayas verdigados. And these are one of the most unique things Spain thinks of. And basically they are dresses that have cord or lengths of reed sewn onto them, and they're sewn into the, they're sewn in casings, and then the casings are sewn on the dress. And it either provides subtle stiffening that ripples if it's done with the rope or cord, or it provides very stiff shaping to the dress if it's done with the reeds. And you can see how the striped camisa can show out. And what shows at the neck is not actually the camisa. That is, I'm forgetting the word. Let me pull it up a second. That is probably a Gorguera. And the Gorguera is a garment that ties around your chest and covers your chest. The English word for it is partlet. And it's basically a panel of fabric, and we'll take a look at it in a little bit. Let me see if I can pull it up. Here's what your Gorguera is one of these. And what you see at the neck, worn with those camisas with the stripes, is actually a Gorguera with stripes. And then over top of all that, you could wear this neat little shaved cape called a Gabon. And you can see that worn with one of the hopas here, that they would just layer them on top. And the hopas, what made them really unique is they could have a really tall collar and they could be slashed all around. And that was a unique Spanish version of the hopa. So do we have any questions about those? Because there's some really unique items in there. Are we good?
I think you're good.
Okay. Well, as we can see, and you'll see when I add the images and share the link later, there's some really, really unique looks that are available for Spain during the 15th century. And again, the most typical headdress was the cofia y trenzado. And what this basically is cofia, translates to coif, and it's what you wear over your head. And we have images of women wearing just this with a braid to go to sleep. And then the trenzado is the equivalent for the braid casing. And we have images of women wearing just the braid casing. And then we have lots of images of women wearing them together. And the cofia can take many styles. It can be just a loose bag gathered at the braid casing. It can be shaped to fit. And when they're shaped to fit, often they have a line of embroidery down the back seam. And they can be done as little caps and put as a cap on the head that goes with the braid casing. And I'm not sure if these are differences of, all of these definitely exist at the same time, from what I can tell. So I suspect that they are regional variances, because as far as I can tell, the different styles exist at similar times. And then some of the other options for on your hair are your crespina, or your hairnet, or your rolo, which is a padded roll that you can put on your head that can be decorated with gems. And you can wear a crespina under your cofia y trenzado, and you can wear a crespina with your rolo.
So one question we had is, how does the coif stay on?
That's a tricky one. If you have slippery hair, what I like to do, and we have no evidence of this in period, is I'll make some temple braids and pin it into my temple braids. However, we have no evidence of this. We have multiple pictures where a servant girl's cofia has dropped down and is hanging from her trenzado. So it looks like the only thing really holding it on firmly is that it's somehow wrapped firmly at the base of the trenzado. There are instances when it has a strap around the top of it and that does help hold it on a little. And if you pin with small pins into a braid in your hair, or a coif in your hair, a hairnet in your hair, it will hold on well through that strap. So what I often do if I want to be as accurate as possible is I'll put a hairnet on, secure the hairnet to my braids, and then put that band around the top of my head that we can see here in this one, and then pin through that into my hairnet and braids. But I can't see pins in any of the pictures. So we're really not sure what would have held them on. And there's some images where they're really far back on the head. And the only way that I can imagine them holding on is with some kind of comb or support. Because sometimes you see them in a way that they're just not going to hold on without some heavy duty pinning. But for modern use, if you want it to stay steady, temple braids and pins is the best way to go. And I will sometimes wear we have a few instances of this. In Italy, they very often did a circlet to hold them on. And I'm gonna switch a second. Okay, can you guys see my face now?
Yes.
Okay. In Italy, they would often wear a band like this over top of a headdress similar to the cofia y trenzado. And if you do that, it holds it on very securely. However, it looks like this horizontal band was very rare in Spain. So unfortunately, the best way to hold it on is what makes you look Italian instead of Spanish. So I don't know what to tell you there. It's just a hard headdress to hold on. Any other questions?
That looks like it's it. Thank you.
Okay. So now El Andalus is pretty much only Granada from now on. And the items of clothing are similar to what they were in the previous century. We have the sarwil or zaraguil, which could be either extra long to create folds or basically like shorts. And as I discussed previously in the last class, these horizontal folds that they like really don't stay in place on their own. And the only way those of us that have tried to recreate them have found that works is if you run a stay tape or gathering stitch along the inside and outside seams. But in this layer, that's not as necessary because they would wear socks called tarabique over top of them to create even more folds. So if you make them a little long, basically that will give the tarabique something to grab onto. The camise at this time was basically a shirt, so about hip length, and it was slit down the front. We don't know whether these gorros started higher up or at waist length. I would think close to waist length, but we have evidence on some of the tunics that it looks like the gorros start pretty much at armpit level. So over top of the camise, your first attractive garment would be called the Maluta, and it could be party colored or solid. And then over top of the Maluta, you have the atabe, and that would have buttons all the way down and a collar, and it could have patterns or be plain, and it could be party colored too, and it could also have sleeves or be sleeveless. Then you have your veiling set, and we are guessing what these look like from the images, but it looks very like a half circle veil, and the rodete that holds it on, it might be a gathered scarf with bits wrapped around the sides, because you can see the little wrapped bits in the images. Or it could be a stuffed roll with wrapped bits as decorative bits. We really can't tell for sure, and it wasn't clear from the text. And then over top of everything to envelop you would be the almalafa. And this was our conjecture from looking at the images of how it's probably constructed. And this actually looks like some modern Muslim garments. So we think that our conjecture is probably close to accurate.
So Michelle asked, were any of the all Andalus layers belted?
We don't see them belted in the images. The Sarawil and the Zaraguel had cords, and the cords could be woven to be really gorgeously decorated, and they could even have messages on them. But the end result is shown unbelted. And I'm sorry that this looks like it's faded on my screen. Excuse me. I'm sorry this looks like it's faded on my screen. It should show up better if you look at the handout link itself. And if you get the Google link for my handout, which I believe we shared to the files, the Google Docs link will always show you the most updated version. And I'm planning to add color handouts to that. I just didn't want to have color images in the video that's going out because I'm not completely sure which ones are fair use and which ones aren't. And for some of the eras, I have to use some that I'm a bit dubious about. So I want to make sure that I don't broadcast any images on a YouTube link, that I keep it private so that it counts as fair use. But yeah, we have images of the Muslim women that were drawn, and they are shown unbelted. It's shown in a very loose, enveloping kind of way. Any additional questions?
I think that's it right now.
Okay. 16th century, there is a heck of a lot going on. And I'm going to pull out my printouts to help me keep that straight a second. Because 16th century gets busy, busy, busy. Okay, so I've kind of got it divided into early 16th and later 16th. And what we're going to talk about first is, yes, 1492, we have the expulsion of the Sephardi from Spain. And I believe it is 1513, we have the expulsion or forced conversion of the Muslims from Granada. So in this century, you could not live openly as a Sephardi or a Muslim in Spain. You have a little bit longer in Portugal, but not that long. But that doesn't mean that you can't still, if your faith is Jewish or Islam, have that character and reenact somebody from those ages with those faiths. We have significant evidence that people falsely converted and continue to practice their faith. It meant living outwardly as much like a Christian as you could, but many of them did their best to eat according to the rules of their faith and still do the little clothing things like not, hold up a linen veil with a wool circlet and such things. So there were definitely groups that did try to continue their faith in secret. So while it's not officially something that existed, it is something that is very possible. It wouldn't have been pleasant in any way, shape, or form, but I always like to try to support people in having, in being able to reenact their faith if it's at all possible, and it is still possible during this time. So the Christian kingdoms are pretty much now all of Spain, and the New World has been found, and there's a lot of wealth, and styles change really fast. So we're going to see some of the styles are the same as from before. You can see our old saya or brial with its little sleeve poofs and gathered waist. You can see the old saya verdigado with the camisa morisca, the camisa with the stripes. And these are some of the things that we're going to add. So your underlayers are going to be the same. You've got your calzones or zaragueles for your underwear. You've got your calzas for your socks. Your camisas, you have similar variety to before, only now everything has a fairly large neckline because all of our necklines are going to be fairly low. Except we will get into later part, there's high necklines as well. But we're looking at the first part of the 16th century now. We've got the saya that it usually has kind of a rounded square neck, though it can vary a little. Gathered to the waist, tapered sleeves. It can be sleeveless, and it can have sleeves with slits down it, and it can have multiple slits, and it can have fewer slits than this. It can just have a slit at the elbow, or it can just have slits from the elbow. So there's a couple varieties. Then basically, you choose what you put on top of your saya. The camisas moriscas with the stripes basically only go with the saya verdigado. Any of the plain camisas can go with anything else. One of the simplest things that I really love is this garment called the gonete or saihuelo, which is basically a little jacket. It can be sleeveless. Its sleeves can be closed all the way down. It can be as long as like knee length or as short as barely hip. And you just toss that on top of your saya for another layer. So it's really easy and casual, and it's one of the best ways, if you're not going high nobility, to keep warm and modify your dress for weather. Other options are just a sobre saya, and this is just a dress with a waist seam. As the century goes on, it becomes more pointed. At the beginning, it's more straight, and it can have various slashes along the sleeve and a couple varieties of neckline as the century goes on. And then a couple options as well were the saya francesca. And that's what they call what other costuming places, using the English terms, usually call, and I'm trying to think of it now because I just lost it, the Flemish gown or the Tudor gown. The Spaniards call it the saya francesca, the French dress. And the interesting thing the Spanish do with this saya francesca, the French dress, is there's some images of it striped. with the wide sleeves and striped, and it's really fun. Now with the Saya Francesca, they would wear a toca de estilo Franco Flamenco. So that's the hat in the style French Flemish. And I'm forgetting the name of the teacher, but there's a teacher that studies just that style and goes really in depth into that. And she's teaching the Franco-Flemish men's clothing. And she goes really deep into this Hispano-Flemish style for women as well. And basically that headdress was a coif or a two-layered headdress. And it could have a veil on top of it. And one of the unique things that the Spaniards did with this veil that we don't see many other places is most countries this would just be black. In Spain, they went all kinds of colors. There's images with it red, there's images with it burgundy. There's an extant one that is pale blue with gold embroidery. And they don't know the country it's from, but it really looks Spanish to me. Because that's another thing the Spaniards would do is they would embroider their veil, while other countries usually wore it fairly plain, maybe with a line of trim. The Spaniards would do all kinds of embroidery on it, often in gold work. So they really went extra with the toca de estilo Franco Flamenco. And even one other thing they did was the cofia y trenzado was still popular at this time. And they would sometimes wear the cofia y trenzado under the toca de estilo Franco Flamenco, which looks really cool to have the little trenzado poking out the bottom of this. So yes, that covers the different styles of dress that they could wear. And then we just had to include this style of sombrero because it's so fun with all the different tassels. And you could wear it if you were going outside and traveling. And we can see now the cork sandals that were worn by the Muslims in, I think it was the 14th century, are now worn by the Christians in the 16th century as chappanes. And I'm really looking forward to watching the video of the class about those because I find them fascinating. So now we're gonna look at the later part of the 16th century. And I'm gonna pull those notes up so I can keep track too, because there's so much going on here, I lose track. Do we have any questions about styles in the earlier part of the 16th century?
Any questions? Just so you know, there's about 20 minutes left.
Yep. We might end a little early on this one. So your undergarments are going to be the same. Over top, you have a variety of camisa. And these can be embroidered, especially for the noble women. So you can have rectangular construction with a square neck. You can have fairly rectangular construction and gathered a bit, and wide sleeves for some of the dresses. Ah, kitty cat. You can have it gathered at the neck and the sleeves, and then you would wear this with a gorguera to attach your, what is the way of it? Cuello de la tutilla. Or you're going to wear it high necked and pin your ruffled collar right to the neck of your camisa. So over your camisa, you would first put your underskirt. And this layer of skirt is primarily to kind of keep the rest of your skirts away from your legs and give you some stiffness and floof. My kitty's saying hi. people have theorized, looking at the illustrations, that this is actually a wrapped skirt. That is a very large semicircle, and then you wrap the ties around your waist.
Okay,
Then over top, yes, we have
questions about the hats real quick.
Oh yeah, sure.
So had a couple questions about that. It says, what were the hat tassels made of? Wool?
I do not remember. I'm thinking it was silk, but I'm not sure.
Okay, and the other question was the sombrero. Was it a felt hat or a seamed fabric hat?
From what I have seen of it, it was felted wool.
Thank you.
But yeah, it looks to be a shaped felted hat. Okay, so then over your underskirt, you would have your corpino, which is your bodies. And that's to keep you smooth. If you were poorer, you could tie sleeves directly into your corpino and wear a faldeta, a skirt on top, and be done. You could also, if you were poorer, wear a cuerpo bajo with manguillas over that, and either a faldeta or a basquina, which is the skirt with stripes to match the cuerpo bajo. And you could also go outside like that if you were of the less noble classes. If you were of the higher classes, over top of this, you would put your verdigado. And this is what the saya de verdigado evolved into. It evolved into a stiffened underskirt to give your overskirt shape. And we see the verdigado showing up all over Europe. Now you could tie over your cuerpo bajo, or over your corpina, your gorguera, which covers your chest. And it could, towards the end of the period, have a fold down collar, or towards the beginning, have a cuello de lejudía, which is your ruffled collar, your ruff. And you could also tie, sorry, I'm having cat interference. You could also tie around your verdigado, your pocket, your falto de guerra. And those would be your underlayers. Your underlayers are a lot more complicated. And then any of these could be your mid layers as a noble woman. And like I said, your mid layers for a noble woman are your outside layers as a poorer woman. So you choose between a cuerpo bajo and sleeves and a vasquina, or a jubón femenino, which is a doublet with a basquina. And whatever set you pick, the trim is usually matching. And then if you wanted, with either sets of these, to go out without another layer of dresses, you could put your ropa over top and then go out. But if you wanted to get really dressed, you would have to put on either a low-necked saya entera de cuerpo bajo, and that's just saying it's a dress with a low body, or a saya entera de cuerpo alto, which is saying that the neck and the body are high because it comes all the way to the neck. And you have options on the sleeves. These are mangas de puntas, sleeves of points, or mangas redondas, round sleeves. And I'm still learning what makes the difference between the doublet of a saya entera and the jubón femenino. It's something about how these connect to the skirts and the decoration makes the jubón femenina and the basquina different from a saya entera. They're distinctly different layers, and there's something distinctly different about the construction at the waist. And I'm still trying to figure that out. Do we have any questions before we move on to other layers?
No.
Okay. So with that, what we see when we look at their heads is usually only the gora, the little hat. But at the back, they would often have, did we not have that there? Oh, we're missing the little braid. But in the back, they would often have fake braids that were covered with gems and a little kofia to cover the back of their head. So that hat we see on the top, the gora on top, is not everything. They would often have the fake braids with the gems, the kofia to cover their bun in the back, a velo. The velo is the veil now, the scarf, and that would often be sheer, and then the gora on top. So there's a lot of layers to their headdress that don't show up in the pictures we see in the books. And then again, over top of all of that, you could wear the ropa to go outside, and it could have it could be sleeveless, or it could have slits in the sleeves. We have the chopins, or another version called galacha, to go out. And then there's some fun traveling attire. A friend told me that I had to include the mask, and I found the word for it and then lost it before I did the handout. And then the capilla de camino, the hat of the road, and the capote or the capotillo, which is the little garment that they wear when traveling to keep clean.
So Adrian was asking what type of embroidery was used.
You can see embroidery. The big fad was for the metallics if they could. There was lots of silver because lots of silver was coming in from the New World. But you do also see embroidery in different multicolors. If you look at my Flickr, which is something that I have in the bibliography, I have a Flickr to the Siglo del Oro exhibition. And in that exhibition, okay, here we go. But yeah, if you look at my Flickr, which I've got the Flickr highlighted, and look at the Siglo del Oro exhibition, there are photos of various 16th century embroideries in there, as well as 16th century garments. There's a whole section of priest vestments, which is where most of the embroideries in general survived. From the garments, I remember there was black embroidery on some of the camisas, including some black lace, though that one was slightly post-period. And there was primarily the metallic embroidery on the garments is what I remember. But there was a really lovely partlet and a dress that has embroidery in that collection. So if you look at the Siglo del Oro album, you'll be able to see what they embroidered with. Were there any other questions? That is, I am afraid, the end of it then.
If there's any other, please put them in chat and we'll be happy to ask.
Yep.
Perfect.
Yeah, the rest of the handout includes an annotated bibliography to make it easier for people to do further research. And at the very end, I have a selection of recommended patterns for the Christian garments. And these are things that I have figured out from sewing them for myself. Some of them, and because I know that a lot of people do not draft their own patterns and have asked me over the years, how do I make this? So I've got that in the back for the Christian garments.